All right, so we are on top of Lamed Amud Aleph, top of 30a. So we're middle of a bit of a mind-twisting discussion. So where are we at? We're at understanding and explaining why Rabbi Yochanan was perplexed by Rabbi Yossi. The reason is like this. Rabbi Yossi agreed. Let's rephrase it this way. We have three sages who all agree that when it comes to kachim, when it comes to sacrificial food, there can be a fourth degree impurity. Yeah. So it touched something, that would be number 3, which touched something, that would be number 2, which touched something, that would be number 1. Fourth degree. So Rabbi Yossi, Abba Shaul, and Rabbi Meir. Now, Rabbi Yossi reasoned his way to this conclusion by Kal V'chomer. A person who's in his purification process, who's gone to mikvah the night set, but hasn't brought his carbon the next day, so at that juncture, he may eat teruma. He is pure as far as teruma goes, and yet confers impurity to kachim. He confers impurity to sacrificial food. So much more so, a number 3 in the process of impurification, which itself is forbidden for teruma, how much more so it could confer to a number 4 on kachim. That was Rabbi Yossi's reasoning. To which Rabbi Yochanan said, and this is what the Gemara explained yesterday, if that's your line of reasoning, clearly you're not of the view of Abba Shaul. You must be following the sages.
That's Rabbi Yochanan.
This is what Rabbi Yochanan is saying. And the sages are of the view that it does not go past 3. It doesn't go to 4 on kachim. He equates kachim and truma. So why is it that you, Rabbi Yossi, can't be like Abba Shaul? This is what we explained yesterday. Because if you were to follow Abba Shaul's reasoning, then what would he say? He would have said like this. Instead of going to the person who went to mikveh, had his nightfall, and is waiting for the next day carbon, go back a step. The person who came out of mikveh before nightfall, at that juncture, he may eat chulin. He can eat ordinary food, not truma, but he can eat ordinary food. And yet this person, if he touches any piece, truma, let's say, yeah, truma, he is a number 2. He touches truma, that becomes number 3, right? And then that one touches something else, which makes a number 4, So how much more so, a number 2, which itself is forbidden for chulin, certainly can make a 3 and a 4. Yeah. If this guy who came out of mikveh may eat chulin, and yet makes a 3-4 for kachim, for sacrificial food, so how much more so? A number 2, which itself is forbidden for chulin, will definitely make a 3 and a 4. This is what he should have said had he followed Abba Shaul. And the fact that he didn't means he follows the sages. And if he follows the sages, says Rabbi Yochanan, I don't understand you, because the sages stopped at 3, didn't go to 4. This is where we left off.
You just interrupted him.
Yeah.
The person who goes to the mikveh to purify himself.
Yeah.
Instead of going in the morning, if he goes in the afternoon and he waits until nightfall.
Yeah, he has a very short time.
Still very good.
Yeah, as long as he goes before nightfall. So it could be a very brief time. In other words, this stage between mikveh and nightfall could be very short. Yeah.
Hashmashis is considered okay.
I don't remember correctly, but I think it has to be before Ben Hashmashis. Not mistaken.
Yeah.
The really long period is when you go from nightfall till he can bring the carbon the next morning. Because the earliest he can bring the carbon the next morning is after the morning sacrifice. So it'll be at least 12 hours from nightfall till that would be the longest period of time. Yeah, so you're right. In theory, this space between going to mikveh and nightfall could be very short.
Mm.
And it seems that it would be very short, right? Because like we mentioned yesterday, the first Mishnah Bracha says, when do you know to say the night Shema? When the Kohanim come home to eat their truma. So come home from where? From the mikveh, probably. So it was a half an hour difference between mikveh and when nightfall, probably. Yeah, exactly. That's right. Exactly. Before Ma'ariv, go to the mikveh, half an hour there, daf Ma'ariv, and then come home and eat, finish. So the whole thing could be an hour. Yeah. The longer period would be till the next morning when he brings the carbon. Okay, so now what the Gemara is going to do is, the Gemara is going to suggest perhaps a side reason for why Rabbi Yossi rejects Abba Shaul's reasoning. But then the Gemara is going to say, no, that's not a good rejection, and therefore he should have taken Abba Shaul, and he didn't take Abba Shaul because he's like the sages, and thus we have Rabbi Yochanan's confusion as to why Rabbi Yossi goes to number 4 if he follows the sages who stop at 3. This is where we're going right now. So let's see. Second line on 30a, Lamed Amud Aleph. Unless you suggest that the reason why Rabbi Yossi rejected Abba Shaul's line of reasoning, even though in essence he agrees with Abba Shaul, is Mishum De'ika Lemifrach, because perhaps the counter argument to the line of reasoning of Abba Shaul would be as follows. Malat Ful Yoim, what happens when someone who goes to mikvah before nightfall, right? Shekain Av Hatuma. He is someone who is capable of being a primary. This is something we had earlier, that the degree of your transference, of some items transference, is contingent upon what level this item could be theoretically. So even though this person right now is only a number 2, but this person in theory could become a primary. If he produced his own impurity, or if he touched a dead body, he becomes a primary. So because he's capable of being a primary, therefore, even though he's number 2, he has a higher potency of transference. Whereas the loaf of bread, which is only a number 2 to begin with, it could never be a primary, and therefore maybe that's why it can't go 3 and 4. So Abba Shaul's line of reasoning, which is that a guy who comes out of mikveh may eat chulin, he may eat ordinary food, and yet makes 3, 4 for kachim. So much more so, a loaf of bread, which to begin with is number 2, can definitely make 3 and 4. Maybe you can counteract by saying, no, they're separate issues. The person who comes out of mikveh, even though he is number 2, he's capable of being a primary, and thus is a greater level of transference. Whereas that piece of food can never be a primary, and therefore it has a lower degree of transference. And maybe that's why you shouldn't. Maybe that's why Rabbi Yossi rejected Abba Shaul's line of reasoning, but not because he disagrees with him inherently.
Can you also compare not just with food, to full yom, but compare to the one who waited for nightfall? Compare those two.
That's the guy. Full yom is the person waiting for nightfall.
Right, and also, but comparing also to the person who did wait for nightfall.
Oh, that's the Gemara says. But the reason why this cannot be Rabbi Yossi's rejection is because I seen him in Rabbi Yossi himself, in his line of reasoning, derived it from the person, right, who is night fell already and is waiting for the carbon. And that's how he deduces reasoning. And yet, V'loi Parcha, and Rabbi Yossi didn't say, I'm rejecting that line of reasoning because here's a person who's capable of being a primary. Which means, according to Rabbi Yossi, the notion of someone capable of being a primary is not a consequence.
There's no degrees within degrees.
That's right. In Rabbi Yossi's view, we don't consider the fact that because this person is capable of being a primary, therefore has a high level of transference. How do I know that? Because it derived from a person who's already waited for nightfall. Nightfall already happened, waiting for his carbon the next day. He derived from that. And he didn't reject it by saying, oh, well, this is a human being who's capable of being a primary.
Oh, so if he's waiting, then he's going to keep himself.
Waiting. Okay, so in the process of becoming pure.
If he knows what he's doing the next day, then he's going to.
Right. So exactly. So here's what's happening. There's in the process of becoming pure, there's 3 stages. Some people only need 2, but sometimes the person needs 3. These 3 stages are, number 1, like this. He goes to mikveh during daytime, stage 1. Stage 2 is night sets. Stage 3 is he brings the carbon the next day. After each stage, he becomes pure for regards to something else. After going to mikveh, he becomes pure as far as eating ordinary food goes. After nightfall, he becomes pure as far as eating truma, the tithe, goes. Next day after carbon, now he can even eat sacrificial food.
So he's pure.
So it's stages of purification. And in each stage, he's pure with regard to another degree of food item. Yeah. So Rabbi Yossi deduced from the guy whose night fell already, so he's capable of eating truma, of eating tithe, but may not eat sacrificial food. And if he were to touch sacrificial food, he would transfer to it. So much more so a food item which itself is impure for tithe on number 3 can transfer to number 4. And Rabbi Yossi did not reject this by saying, well, a human being is capable of being a primary, which means the notion of a human being capable of being a primary is of no consequence to Rabbi Yossi. And therefore, if that's the case, Rabbi Yossi should have used Abba Shaul's line of reasoning, which is that a person who came out of mikveh before nightfall, when he's allowed to eat ordinary food, he still confers 2, 3, and 4 to kachim. That should have been the line of reasoning. And the rejection as the fact that this person is capable of being a primary is of no consequence to Rabbi Yossi, because he already used it from a human being at a different stage. Following?
Sort of. I have to go. Have a good day.
Follow that, Robert, or no?
I think so. Is it that the conclusions are all the same?
But the bottom line is that this indicates that Rabbi Yossi should have used Abba Shaul's line of reasoning. And he didn't, which means he follows the sages. And therefore Rabbi Yochanan is perplexed. Why are you, Rabbi Yossi, going to level 4? If the sages say it stops at level 3.
The reason why.
This is the reason why Rabbi Yochanan was perplexed. So yes, the conclusion remains the same.
Yeah, because
But this is why.
Yossi doesn't follow that.
But we're proving that he doesn't. We're proving why that Rabbi Yossi
because
should have. He should have followed the line of reasoning of Abba Shaul, and yet decided not to, because he follows the sages. And that's the question. How do I know he should have used the logic of Abba Shaul? The reason why I know he should have used that logic is because any rejection to that logic would apply to his own logic, which is why he should have used it anyway. Meaning the rejection that this human is capable of being a primary. That same rejection applies to his own logic. So if you don't care for that rejection, then take Abba Shaul. Why didn't you? Because you follow the sages. If that's the case, why are you going to number 4 when the sages stop at number 3? Okay, so this really ends this part of the discussion. So if you didn't follow everything till now, we can rejoin now at this point, because now it's going to become not a new subject entirely, but a new beginning within the subject. So even if you didn't follow what was going on till now, which is, I guess, a little complex, now we can follow. Okay, so let's begin this discussion. Amar Rav Asi. Rav Asi said, Amar Rav in the name of Rav. Yeah, you have it there. It's sorry?
I have it.
Yeah. Amrila. Others say it wasn't Rav Asi in the name of Rav, but Amar Rabba ben Isi Amar Rav. It was Rabba, son of Isi, in the name of Rav. Okay, both of these say it in the name of Rav. It's either Rav Asi speaking in the name of Rav, or Rabba, son of Isi, speaking in the name of Rav. So what did Rav say? Rav said as follows: Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Lazar, and Rabbi Elazar. 5 sages. These are all 5 sages. Let's do a little timeline to understand what's happening. Right? We have the era of the Mishnah, Mishnaic era. We have the era of the Gemara. Those are the 2 general eras, right? The Tanoim and Amoraim. The Mishnah is compiled by Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. So scholars before him are era of the Mishnah. Scholars post him are era of the Gemara. Rav is at the beginning of the era of the Gemara, 2nd generation. He learned from Rabbi Yochanan, and Rabbi Yochanan learned already from Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, which means the compiler of the Mishnah, his students are already the era of the Gemara, but they're the first era of the Gemara. The next generation is Rav already. Yeah. Now these 5 scholars here, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Lazar, and Rabbi Lazar, Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Lazar, Rabbi Lazar, these are all scholars just before the era of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. So it's the 2nd to last generation of the Mishnah. In fact, this generation is the primary authorship of the Mishnah. When Rabbi Yehuda compiled the Mishnah, he compiled from the generation just before him, mostly these scholars. We're missing Rabbi Shimon here also, right?
So Rabbi,
I think Rabbi Lezer is actually Rabbi Shimon's son. So we're missing some people of that generation. But that's the primary generation. These are the primary speakers of the Mishnah. And they're already speaking in the name of the earlier generations. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, Rabbi Gamliel, and going all the way back to Hillel and Shammai and so on. But the primary speakers in the Mishnah are these scholars of this generation. So Rav is speaking about the scholarship of 2 or 3 generations before him. This is the timeline, yeah? And this information is being brought to us by generation down, either Rabbi Isi or Rabbi Ben Isi. Clear? Okay. So says Rav, Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Shua, Rabbi Lezer, Rabbi Lezer, all these 5 scholars, Kulu, they are all of the view, Sfira Lahu, all of them are of the view, De'ein Sheni Oisa Shlishi, B'chulin. That second degree impurity does not confer to a third degree in ordinary food. So we've already established this principle before, that the more sensitive, spiritually sensitive the recipient is, the more potent it can receive, right? It can be a recipient of impurity. So chulin, ordinary food, goes to number 2, and it stops there. So the classic example we used before, which is where we derive this whole law, Rabbi Kiva told us how to derive this law, that was truma. So let's say sheretz, a forbidden, creepy crawly sheretz, goes into the airspace of a kli cheres, of an earthenware vessel. So the sheretz is the avatuma, that's the primary. The earthenware vessel is a number 1, rishon, and then this number 1 touches a food item. That's number 2. Yeah. This number 2, if it then touches something else, what happens? Depends what it touches. If the other thing is chulin, ordinary food, nothing happens. If it touched truma, then that becomes impure. On number 3, a shlishi. Now, what happens if that number 3 touches something else? Depends what it's touching. If it touches another truma, nothing happened, because number 3 doesn't make number 4 in truma. But if it touched kachim, if it touched sacrificial food, then that becomes a 4th degree, right? So each one stops at a different stage. Chulin, ordinary food, only goes to number 2, stops there. Truma goes to number 3, stops there, and kachim, sacrificial food, goes to number 4 and stops there. So here we're discussing stage 1. Rabbi Rav tells us that all these 5 scholars, they all agree that the ein sheni oisa shlishi b'chulin, that a number 2 does not make a number 3 in ordinary food. This primary stage of impurity. And now what the Gemara is going to do is the Gemara is going to go through, hope the audio is working till now, the Gemara is going to go through Mishnaic age texts in which we identify each of these scholars stating or implying this fact. So it's going to be a lot of repeated laws from different angles coming to the same conclusion, that when it comes to ordinary food, number 2 doesn't make number 3, it stops at number 2. This is where we are. Yeah, we're clear?
Yeah.
How long does sacrificial food last?
Sacrificial food.
Before it goes bad. Then it's
Okay, so before it goes bad, technically, like on a technical level, halachically it goes bad. Most, if not all, sacrificial food have a timeline when you can eat them. Either a day and a half, a day, overnight, 2 days and a half, whatever, 2 days each. So if you look at the last Mishnahs we learn, we read before we begin Shachris, right? Before Haidu, we begin with Ezau Mokaiman, right? The last few paragraphs before.
Mhm.
So read those in English, and you'll see. It'll tell you each type of sacrificial offering, where it's to be offered at the temple, who eats it, and until what point. Is it burned completely in the altar, and does it have to be finished burned by the next day? Is it eaten by the kohanim, or eaten by the kohanim and the owners? So there you can see the time frame of how long
In the morning blessing.
in the just before Haidu.
Yeah.
Just before Haidu. Before Rabbi Shmuel Lemer, Rabbi Shmuel Lemer is a paragraph right before Haidu. Before that, we begin with Ezau Mokaiman.
just before we sing.
Shebana. That's right. So the paragraph right before is Rabbi Shmuel, and the paragraph before that is Ezau Mokaiman. So over there it goes through
Tells you how long you have to eat.
how long you're allowed, you may eat from each of the various different types of
Do
sacrifices.
eat,
That's right. So forget going bad. Before it goes bad, just technically, halachically, it stops becoming valid at a certain point. And then it becomes nicer and has to be burnt, and it has its own laws. Sorry?
Yeah, I was trying to
Yeah,
remember.
nicer means remainders. Remainders of sacrificial items that's
Forbidden to eat.
forbidden to eat after a certain point.
So what if somebody eats it after the point? Does he become
The carrot?
Yeah, it's a serious halachic offense. Does he become impure? I don't remember. I don't remember if he becomes impure, but it's a very serious offense. Yeah,
I'm sure he's got to go to the
I don't
I
remember.
don't know if he imparts
I don't remember.
impurity.
I don't remember. Maybe rabbinically, something's ringing the bell. I don't remember. I don't want to comment. I don't remember. Okay, so let's at least today do Rabbi Meir. Let's see the source for Rabbi Meir saying that number 2 in ordinary food doesn't go to number 3. That the buck stops at number 2 with regard to ordinary food. So Rabbi Meir agrees with this. The Tanan, as we learn, kol hata'on bius mayim midivrei seifrim, anything that requires going to the mikveh on a rabbinic level. So what this is, Rashi gives a few examples. I'll just give you one. There are biblical impurities, and then there are rabbinic impurities. One of the rabbinic impurities is that if you've went to a swimming pool, not a kosher mikveh, then you have to go to mikveh after that. And the reason they did that, the reason they did this is because it seemed that at some point people were confusing the mikveh with the shower. They started thinking the shower was where it's at. So they made a rule. You go to shower, that itself makes you impure. And you have to go to the mikveh. For example.
Oh, because showers in those days was like a barrel.
Sorry?
A shower in those days was a barrel with water in it? Well, no, that could
It could be anything, as long as it's drawn water, it's not natural. As long as the water is not naturally collected in that place, it's not a mikveh. If it's drawn, mayim she'uven, if a person's head and most of his body ends up in mayim she'uven, drawn water, he has to go to the mikveh. Likewise, we'll give another example because it's going to come relevant later, but someone who eats half a measure of impure food. So he becomes impure and he has to go to mikveh as well. Right, because...
It's a half a measure in this case.
Sorry?
Is it a kazai?
No, pras is a little bit more, I think. Achilas pras. Okay, so this person who has to go to mikveh rabbinically, says the text, metamas hakodesh, it makes. So this person who has to go to mikveh, a rabbinic ordinance, is treated like a number 2. Is considered a number 2. Yeah, that's what Rashi says.
Render sacrificial food impure.
Yeah. The sages, when they imposed that a person has to go to mikveh, they treat that item or that person like a number 2. So because he's a number 2, says the mayor, if this person, he hasn't gone to mikveh yet, but rabbinically he's required to go to mikveh, touches a sacrificial food, so he makes that sacrificial food impure to the point that it can confer another. Right? Remember we had this difference between the word tameh and the word pasul. If we describe something as tameh, impure, that means it can also confer. If you refer to it as pasul, invalid, it means it's invalid but doesn't confer to the next. Yeah, that was a terminology thing. So the mayor says this person who has to go to mikveh by rabbinic law, and we treat him like a number 2. So metames hakodesh, he makes sacrificial food impure, meaning that it itself can go and confer to another, because he's the number 2. Touch that, number 3, and then that can go to number 4, because we're talking about sacrificial food. Upoisel as a truma, and it invalidates. He will invalidate truma, because he's a number 2. He touched something else, it becomes invalid, and that's truma. Truma stops at 3, right? Because he's a number 2. Umutter b'cholin, and it's completely permissible when he touches cholin, because he's a number 2. And number 2 does not confer number 3 to cholin. This is the proof that Rabbi Meir agrees that number 2 does not make number 3 when it comes to cholin, because a person who has to go to mikveh rabbinically is considered number 2. Right? Following?
Yeah.
Yeah. Now he says Rabbi Meir that the same thing is true of the l'maiser. Same thing is true of if you touched tithe food. Tithe food.
Yeah.
Or he may eat tithe food.
All tithe food or just truma?
Tithe food, not truma. Tithe food is level lower than truma. Tithe food for the Levite or whatever. Truma is of a higher level. Okay. So Rabbi Meir says again, we treat this person who has to go to mikveh rabbinically as a number 2, and because he's a number 2 rabbinically, he has all the laws of number 2 as described. He can go and make he's number 2. He can make a 3 and 4 for sacrificial food. He can make a number 3 for truma, but he can make nothing for chulin, for ordinary food. So here we see Rabbi Meir's of the view that it makes that number 2 does not transfer number 3 in ordinary food. Clear?
I'm just reading what's here.
Yeah.
In English. It says under Rabbi Meir.
Yeah.
Renders sacrificial food impure upon contact with second degree impurity.
He is second degree, making that thing third degree.
Is that how you read it?
It should be that way. That's what Rashi says it.
Says with,
That's what Rashi says it. Metamas hakodesh li'eshlishi.
This is confusing.
Rashi reads it. It says straight up. Metamas hakodesh li'eshlishi. He confers impurity onto the sacrificial food to make it a number 3. Yaser revi, and he can make a number 4. Upoistan is a truma, and he invalidates truma because he's number 2, making the truma number 3, and stops there when it comes to truma. That's straight up in Rashi.
So the person is unclean.
Yeah.
And he lives on a farm.
Meaning ritually he's impure.
He's impure, and he lives on a farm.
Yeah.
And he has no access to a mikveh. What does he do?
Farm guys have the easiest access to mikveh. Because a lot of them have springs or rivers. You just go right there. Spring or river is better than a mikveh. It's a natural spring. It's even better than a mikveh. So most of them would have an easy time. If the big cities, we have a problem. We don't have natural springs. We just got to start collecting rainwater because it's more problematic. But in the countryside, it's the easiest thing, the mikveh. The whole invention of a mikveh, as you know it, for rainwater, only happened once you start having big cities and they weren't near rivers. So until then, you're just near a river. But now that you're living in big cities, you're not near rivers, you have a problem. So we collected this whole rainwater business. Okay, so let's conclude the text. The sages disagree with Rabbi Meir in one regard. Rabbi Meir said that a person who has to go to mikveh rabbinically may partake of meiser because he considers meiser like ordinary food, and because he's a number 2, doesn't impart to ordinary food, and therefore doesn't impart to meiser either. But the sages disagree and say he can touch meiser, but he can't eat meiser. Because he himself is a number 2, even though he's not going to confer impurity to number 3, but he can't eat the meiser. Which means the sages agree with the principle that number 2 doesn't make number 3 in chulin, in ordinary food. So why wasn't it listed in Rav? Rav only listed 5 scholars: Meir, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Shua, Rabbi Lezer, and Rabbi Lazar. So why doesn't he list the sages?
Like a safeguard.
No, so the Rashi explains because Rav wanted to list identifiable people, and the sages are unidentified. So he doesn't want to say that. So identifiably, here are 5 names of people who agree that number 2 does not make number 3 in impurity. And so far we have Rabbi Meir. Because Rabbi Meir said that a person who has to go to mikveh rabbinically, who's treated as number 2, may partake of chulin no problem, and doesn't confer anything, but does confer number 3 to truma, and confers 3 and 4 to kachim, to sacrificial. Okay. So one more line, and then we'll stop over here actually. Today's Wednesday. So tomorrow we'll look at Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Lezer and Rabbi Yeshua. We'll look at some of the other ones who also agree with this principle that number 2 does not, that a chulin, number 2, ordinary food, number 2 does not transfer to number 3. So more God willing tomorrow. Wonderful day, Eden. Lots of stuff going on.